Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you again this morning.
Happy September, I guess, right?
Yes, we are chugging right along through December, but we're actually continuing our conversation about kids' behavior. Last episode we talked about sort of some of the typical things. We introduced the problem that we're dealing with, which is that there seems to be this emerging, ongoing pervasive
Epidemic.
epidemic of childhood behavior that's seems to be just getting more and more serious, more and more concerning, and more of a problem, both at home and at school. And so we're spending a couple of podcasts talking about that, and again, kind of talking about it in ways that you don't always hear from us, because we tend to talk about behavior in particular ways, but um, we think that this problem is becoming much, much more complicated, and we need to look a little bit more at solutions, or at reasons to deal with these behaviors in a more complicated way. There's not going to be these simple explanations, simple solutions. We're going to have to find more comprehensive ways to look at these and manage these behaviors. And so we started out looking at, typical behavior development,
Right.
the terrible
Right.
twos, because we've all experienced those.
Yeah, what we're responding to here, and the reason we wanted to take up these topics is that more and more parents, and especially teachers of young children, preschool, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, first and second grade, more and more of them are saying, we're getting these kids that we just can't manage. It's as though they're taking over. We have many parents saying, no, we walk on eggshells in our house because this one child is so volatile, and that we have to be very careful. And we have schools saying, I can't do anything else because I'm dealing with these one or two kids that we just can't get them under control. They're mean-spirited, they're revenge-seeking. They don't do what they're asked. They will attack physically and verbally whenever they want to. Whenever they're asked to do something they don't want to do, they respond sometimes in a physically aggressive manner. And so people are bringing these children to our practice, or teachers are asking these questions and saying, what should we do about these kids?
Right.
Well, it begins, as we said last week, there is a change that occurs in children about age 2 or 3 when they become more competent, that they will begin to express themselves a little more forcefully. But those are typical normal developmental phases that kids go through. They have temper tantrums, and if you ignore the tantrum, it goes away. There are kids who they'll resist you to an extent, but they will back down. Okay, so and that's typically what happens. They don't want to go to bed, but they will. They don't want to get out of the bathtub, but they will. But there's gonna be some resistance. Some kids are a little bit cranky and irritable, but it's cranky and irritable that we can manage. Okay,
Right.
that's normal. What we want to talk about today are these kids who have a difficult temperament
Right.
and challenge us in ways that most of us are not able to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. We kind of ended the last podcast talking about, you know, um, the importance of parents establishing their position, basically, very early in life. By the time the kid is 2 or 3 years old, the child needs to know that the parent is the authority figure. The parent is the one who will make requests, and that the child needs to comply with those requests.
That's right.
Um, Again, they should be willing and able to ask questions if they have questions, to clarify that if they don't know how to do something. Parents should, it's critical that parents teach them. None of the "because I said so" stuff, or "because I'm the parent, that's why" type stuff, but true teaching and authoritative type of parenting. But we get into this, one of the things, I know we talk about often is this idea that good parenting, authoritative type of parenting is often confused and mixed with other types of parenting, like helicopter parenting or gentle parenting. And what happens in those situations is that you go from educating and informing and teaching the child what those expectations are, and that evolves into, well, whenever I ask her to do that, she starts to get upset. So, you know what? It's okay. You don't have to do that because I don't want you to get upset,
Right.
or I don't want you to get too frustrated. So I'm not going to ask you to do something that isn't easy for you. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, the place we're going to start today, and we'll see how things go because we're probably going to need more podcast episodes to cover some of these issues, is some of these other concerns, other factors that contribute to typical child behavior, some of those terrible twos, some of that typical stuff evolving into more problematic behavior that lingers and persists over time. Part of that is stuff within the child having to do with the child's temperament, which we'll talk about. But the other part of that has to do with what in the research they call goodness of fit, the fit between the child's temperament and the parenting style.
Right.
If those two things don't match very well, it can lead to problems. And even the easiest tempered child can begin to have behavioral problems if there's not a good fit between the parenting style and the child's temperament. So
Right.
but we'll start with the child's temperament because that's something born with the child. That is part of the child's, the root of their personality, basically, and they're born with it. You can see
Yeah.
it early on.
Right. The phrases like, well, we're all different or everybody's different. Well, one of the differences is in our temperament, our basic, what we call our basic temperament. And this goes back to the 70s. Experts were talking about different children have different temperaments. If you have children, you know that when you bring a child home from the hospital, some children, some infants are very easy to deal with. They're cuddly and they sleep well and they feed on a regular schedule. And that's called an easy temperament. They're pretty easy to manage. And parents will say, no, she was an easy baby. There are other kids who are difficult. They have a difficult, it's kind of an underlying irritability and there's a fussiness and they might have digestive problems. And there's this condition that a lot of people believe in called colic, that some children have colic. I don't know whether that's real or not. That's another discussion for another day. But there are difficult, even young babies who can be very difficult. Parents will talk about kids who arch their backs and they resist they don't want to be cuddled, they don't want to be held, they don't want to be swaddled, which is very unusual. But there are kids who have what we now call a difficult temperament. All right.
And they like that from the very beginning.
They didn't learn anything. They weren't taught how to do this. It's just what they bring into the world. And we don't know why. That it's just a difficult temperament. But we see in these children, and about 10% of children have what we call a difficult temperament.
Mhm.
And so, what are the constellation of behaviors that we see in very young children? Well, when we talk to parents and teachers about these children, they always talk about the kids seem to have this negative mood, this dark mood. They seem to be, they have adult anger and adult consternation. So there's a negative mood. They're very intense in their emotional expression. They have too much of everything. They have too much happiness. They have too much sadness. They laugh too loud. They cry too hard. There's this intensity of emotional expression that we see. They also don't join in with activities. They'll go to a birthday party and they'll hang back. They won't just jump into the activities like most kids do. They avoid new things. They're very cautious. And then they have what's called reduced rhythmicity. And I don't like that phrase, but what it means is they are not good sleepers. They don't learn how to do complicated things like toileting is very difficult. Learning toilet training becomes very difficult with these kids because they don't get into a nice rhythm of sleeping and eating, and now it's time to rest, and now it's time to play. These are the kids who don't, they go to kindergarten and they don't, or preschool, and they don't nap.
Right.
Most kids get into that napping schedule. We had lunch and we come back and we have a nap and then we go outside. These kids never seem to adjust to a rhythmic, these patterns, these life patterns. They're always sort of doing things,
Right.
they're doing other things according to what they want to do. So there are these very characteristic behaviors that we see in children who have a difficult have a difficult temperament.
Right. Absolutely.
And the other sign that I like to point to is if temper tantrums persist. Um, Most kids have temper tantrums. It's just the way they express their frustrations. But in most kids, temper tantrums are pretty short. They last for a couple of minutes, and if you ignore them, they go away. Any tantrum, if kids have tantrums that last more than 10 minutes, it's probably not just a temper tantrum. It's probably something else. If they persist when they're ignored, most kids will have a temper tantrum, but if parents ignore it, the temper tantrum is going to go away. That's how you know it's a typical temper tantrum, is that if you ignore it, it's going to go away. If you ignore it and it gets worse and persists and goes on for 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes, that's not a typical temper tantrum. If the tantrums include increased risk of harm to themselves or to others, that's more of a sign. And if the tantrums occur after age 5. So temper tantrums give us a pretty good barometer as to whether I'm dealing with normal terrible 2s and 3s, or if I'm dealing with something that might be more serious. So it is a good barometer to use to make that decision. So there are these characteristic patterns that we can observe and help us make the decision that, this is a difficult kid. This child's going to need something other than what I typically do.
Right. And again, you're going to know much of that very early on in the child's life because
Well,
you're going to see that, well, he doesn't get to that feeding routine very well. He's not taking to a sleep routine very well. He's what people call colicky. He has all of these sort of characteristics that suggest that there's more of a difficult temperament. When you're parenting a child who has a difficult temperament, there's a few things that we need to think about. Because again, just because a child has a difficult temperament doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to continue to have problems on into, for the rest of their life.
Mhm.
We have to remember that behavior is an expression of our emotion. Behavior is nothing more than communication. It
Right.
is a communication that is more primitive than your vocabulary or your
Mhm.
spoken word, but it
Right.
is communication nonetheless. And so one of the things that we have to do as parents when we're parenting a child who has a difficult temperament is try to figure out, we have to learn how to interpret what they're trying to say. We have to try to figure out what the child is trying to communicate and then deal with and manage that issue. So if for example, sometimes a child with a difficult temperament may have a really difficult time when you're at the store because they want to buy candy, and if you say no, we're not going to get candy this time, they'll have a temper tantrum. Well, then what they may be communicating is, I don't know that I'll ever be able to get candy again because you may never buy me candy ever again in the first, because you said no. And so no means forever. So you can change the way that you're communicating. You know what? We're going to have dinner as soon as we get home. So maybe the next time we come to the store, we'll get some candy, but we're gonna go home and have dinner now, and then we'll have dessert afterwards. And so we'll get candy next time we come to the store.
Right.
Even a child with a difficult temperament is going to respond to that very different than they would to if you just say, no, we're not getting candy. Uh,
Right.
so we have to figure out, what is the child trying to communicate? Where are their limitations? And then communicate with them in a way that helps them to avoid some of those meltdowns.
Right. And I think if you remember those two things, and look, if I get it, if you're raising a child who has a difficult temperament and will scream and yell and break things, I get it.
Yeah.
It's a really, really difficult thing to do. But if you can keep in mind that behavior is simply the expression of the child's emotions. I mean, as an adult, when you start screaming and swearing, you're expressing your emotions in raw form, but that's all you're doing is you're expressing these very strong emotions. But behavior is also communication. It's a form of communication. And when even when the behavior is destructive and dangerous, the child is still trying to communicate something. And if you can understand what they're trying, if you take a moment, what is this child trying to communicate? Doesn't mean you have to accept it, but at least you have a better understanding of what's happening here. And it may just be that this child needs to unload all this steam, needs to unload all this energy, needs to unload this difficult temperament that she was born with, and she didn't ask for it. She's not doing it on purpose. She was born with this, and we have to help her manage this very difficult temperament.
Absolutely. So one of the ways that we do that, and again, sometimes even before the child is communicating anything and just having some of those that difficult temperament, is,
Right.
is establishing routines and to make sure that the child's basic needs are being met. You know, being on a good, strict routine is difficult for some parents
Right.
without a child.
Right.
However, especially when you have a child with a difficult temperament, making sure that they're eating at about the same time every day, those regular meals, making sure that that you're laying them down to soothe and to calm and to nap or sleep, that's happening at about the same time every day. But
Right.
establish these routines and stick to them. Even if the child is having some difficulty with it, you stick with those routines because eventually they will take onto it. They'll latch onto that, but you have to be consistent with it. It can't be we're going to wake up at 8 o'clock one morning and then at 10 o'clock another morning and then 6 a.m. the next morning. It can't be inconsistent like that. It's got to be as consistent as possible.
We talked a few weeks ago about our bodies love rhythms.
Right.
There's a day-night cycle, there's a monthly cycle, there's a yearly cycle. We have seasons, and our species likes patterns. It likes rhythms. We have brain wave rhythms, and we have digestive tract rhythms, and everything we do is sort of we like rhythm, we like consistency, we like predictability. We don't like uncertainty. We know that. Okay, we talked about uncertainty last week. With these children, the irony is, and the dilemma and the conundrum is, these kids with more difficult temperaments have a greater need for patterns and rhythms, and yet it's infinitely more difficult to establish those with these children. That's part of the difficulty, is these children have to have rhythms, but it's infinitely more difficult to establish rhythms. So that's one of the things one of the first things we tell parents who are raising children with a difficult temperament is the more routines you can establish, the easier your life is going to be. If your child knows that every Tuesday at 7 o'clock, they're going to go to a baseball practice or
Right.
a dance practice. If they start to get into that rhythm, life becomes a little easier. They're not fighting you on Tuesday because they know what's going to happen. Or if you go to church on Sunday, if you go to church every Sunday at 9 o'clock and you do that week after week after week after week, the child will eventually accept that pattern. They'll accept that routine. There's no point in fighting my parents because we're going to be going to church at 9 o'clock on Sunday. Okay, there's
Right.
nothing to fight about. So establish those routines. And then you have to model what you want. If you're screaming and yelling at your child, guess what your child's going to do?
Right.
She's going to scream and yell. Okay. Model what you want. Pick your battles. Get to know your child, and try to highlight your child's strengths, whether they're athletic or musical or school or whatever.
Right.
And you have to raise the child you have. So there are these general principles. I mean, I would like for none of us to have to deal with a child with a difficult temperament, but some of us are, and you're just going to have to learn how to manage this child, who's unlike your other kids. You have 4 or 5 kids, and only one of them has a difficult temperament. But you have to raise that child.
Right.
Now, and I know this is a frustration for parents. When we talk to parents about this stuff, they're they're either polite enough not to say this, or or impolite enough to say it. Yeah, that's all fine, but what do I do when he punches a hole through the wall? What do I do when he goes in and breaks his bedroom window? What
Right.
do I do when he smashes a car against his brother's forehead and his brother has a gash in his forehead? That's why I'm here. What am I supposed to do about that stuff?
Right.
That's their frustration. This is the hard part.
Yes, this is really the hard part because it's and again, this is so much easier when you start early. Um, eh,
Right.
so we're going to start our conversation there, and we'll go from there. But by the time that your child is one, certainly by the time that they're two, your child has to know that if you what you mean that they have to know that you mean what you say. And if
Right.
you say something, that's the rule. That's what has to happen. Now, that puts a lot of responsibility on you as the parent that you don't say something that you don't mean. That,
Right.
that means that you can't say, well, you're grounded for the rest of your life. That's just silly.
Right.
But it also means you can't say, well, you can't have the iPad for the rest of the day and then give it to them 2 hours later because they won't stop messing with you. Your child has to know that you mean what you say. Um,
Right.
and because as soon as they have the impression that you don't, then you don't mean anything that you say, at least in their mind,
That's
especially
right.
a child with a difficult temperament.
Mhm.
They're not going to buy it.
Right.
No matter what you say, if you're not consistent with your words and your actions, your child is going to take advantage of that. That also means you have to be consistent with the other parent. If one parent says one thing and the other parent says something different, your child is going to know who to go to get what they want. And they
Right.
will do that
Hmm.
even as young as 2 years old.
Absolutely.
They
Yeah.
know how to do that. So you have to stick with what you're saying. You have to do as you promise and don't say it if you don't mean it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the first thing that parents need to do with these kids. The problem is these kids are going to fight back, and you have to be willing to outlast them. You
Right.
can. I mean, I know it's difficult, but parents will say, well, I'll say something, and the child will follow me around the house, insisting and insisting and insisting, and I'll lock my bedroom door, and they start kicking the door. And what am I supposed to do? Um, those those moments are when you have to outlast your child. And now you have to be the parent who has enough strength to withstand these attacks, and they are attacks, and to show the child that no matter what they do, you're not going to give in and you're not going to give up. And I know how difficult, I know what I'm asking you to do,
Right.
but sadly, you don't have a choice. They have to know, no matter how difficult they are, they have to know that when you tell them to do something, that you mean it.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that there's something else to this because parents recognize that because it's just what we hear from parents. They just wear me down.
Hmm. Hmm.
They just keep going and going and going, and he wears me down.
Right.
Okay. So what you're saying is that you have a limit of your tolerance. Well, your child has a limit to their tolerance as well.
Right.
So just to build that understanding as to where your kid is coming from, that they can tolerate discomfort, they can tolerate frustration, they can tolerate not getting what they want to a certain level, and then they're gonna act out. Every child will do that. Every human does that because what you're saying is that if your kid keeps pushing you, you reach a limit to where you can't tolerate it anymore, and then you react.
Hmm.
Richard, I think that what you're saying is great advice. You have to find a way as the adult, as the parent, if you want to say, because I'm the parent, because I'm the grown up, here's a place where you have to exercise that. If you're the parent, you have to exercise appropriate behavior. And that appropriate behavior is not reacting to those actions, to that pressure. And I'm going to also throw in that we're talking about kids with difficult temperaments, but rest assured, be very sure to know that even a kid with the easy temperament, if you are inconsistent, if
Hmm.
you are persistently inconsistent with following through with what you say, especially if you say, well, if you keep doing a really good job, we're going to do this. We're going to go to Disney, and consistently you don't follow through with that. or consistently you are inconsistent with providing what you say you're going to provide or doing what you say you're going to do, even your easy temperament child is going to start to have behavior problems.
Right.
You have to be consistent, and your kid has to know that you are the parental authority,
Right.
because this is going to transfer to school too, because the teacher then has the authority there.
Right. When we talk about these insistent, persistent children who will follow you through the house, who will bang on your bedroom door if you lock it, who will become physically aggressive, that becomes your parenting challenge. If your child had a chronic had chronic constipation, some kids have chronic constipation, you would be going to the pediatrician, you'd be giving your child Miralax, you'd be doing whatever you can do. If your child had chronic ear infections, if your child has even a more serious illness, say some kind of developmental delay, like motor skills, you'd be going to the physical therapist. Your life as a parent, your life would change. Okay. Well, it's no different with behavior. If your child is being difficult, you have to do what that child needs. You wouldn't hesitate at all to take your child to a speech program, or to an orthopedic specialist to fix some orthopedic problem. You wouldn't hesitate for a moment. You'd find the time. You'd take off work. You'd get babysitters for the other kids. You would do what you have to do to deal with any physical problem like that. Well, it's the same with behavior. When you have a child who is this intense and this persistent, you then have to become the parent. You have to do whatever's necessary. You're not going to a PT appointment. You're not going to a speech therapy appointment, but you're going to a behavior management appointment. You're going to deal with this child. You're going to deal with this problem. Because once you give in, once your child knows that if I get to this level of intensity, that my parent is going to buckle, that my parent is going to give in, you now are turning your house over to your child. And that you can't do. All right. Absolutely. And so you have to be willing to do whatever's necessary to establish that you are the authority figure. And no matter how far they go, you're not going anywhere, and you're not going to give in. Because once you give in, once they know that you don't mean it, or that they can outlast you, or that they can defeat you, now you've turned everything over to the child. The child has now taken over the house, and you're going to be walking on eggshells.
Right. So especially at this age, and we're talking about younger kids, and we're going to have to do another podcast to talk about older kids, I think.
Yeah. But oh, yeah.
When you're talking about younger kids, there's nothing wrong. And this, I hope folks hear us well with this. There is nothing wrong with your child having a little bit of fear about what's going to happen. Right. When we used to see kids all the time who they had all this challenging, rough behavior at home, but they go to school and they're just fine at school. Talk to those kids, you say, what's the difference? Why? I don't want to go to the principal. They are, for whatever reason, they may have never met the principal, but for some reason, the idea of the principal instills just a little bit of fear in them that they won't act out at school.
Right.
At home, they don't have that. And kids need to know, again, a little bit of fear, not of being harmed, or not that they're going to get beat or anything like that, but fear that my world is going to get very, very small if I don't do what I'm supposed to do. I'm not going to be able to have the privileges that I want. I'm not going to be able to have access to the things I want. I'm not going to be able to do the things that I want to do if I'm non-compliant, and if I battle and push and argue and hit and bite and all those kinds of things. Your child has to know that you're the boss.
Right.
You are a kind boss, perhaps. You are a understanding boss, perhaps. But your word is the final word. And they have to know that. They have to know that from the very beginning.
Right. And the earlier, and this is the point we're trying to make. The earlier you establish dominance, and I don't know how else to say it, you have to establish dominance. You're the parent. You have to be in charge. You can be a benevolent dictator, but you have to be a dictator. The earlier you do that, the easier it's going to be. This is all easier to do with an 18-month-old than it is with a 24-month-old. And it's easier to do with a 24-month-old than it is with a 3-year-old. And
Right.
it's easier at 3 than it will be at 5. So the sooner you do this, the sooner you establish this authority that you are in charge and you are not going to give up, you're not going to give in. It's easier to do that at 24 months than it is at 36 months.
Right.
All right. So do this hard work. It's very, very, very difficult. Do this hard work as early as you can, and it'll be much easier to do. You mentioned that we need another podcast. Yes, you're going to have to reestablish your authority at each stage of development. This battle never ends.
Right.
You know, the 5-year-old is still, you're still going to have to teach the 5-year-old that you're in charge, and the 8-year-old, and the 12-year-old, and the 16-year-old.
Yeah.
It gets more difficult as they get older, but you're going to renew this battle probably at each stage of development.
Right. And you have to renew it, and it gets harder as they get older. But if you did it at 2, it'll be easier at 5 than it were if you didn't do it at 2.
Right.
So it's still easier as you go on if you're doing it each stage. And so yeah, I think in our next podcast or in some podcasts in the future, we're going to address some older kids because I'm sure that there are a lot of folks listening that say, well, we haven't even got to school age yet. We're still talking about toddlers, but because we do need to talk about school age kids and some of the challenges that we're experiencing there as early as elementary school, but certainly by the time they get into middle school. Middle school, I don't know another way to say it except that middle schoolers are a nightmare right now.
Oh, they
We
really are.
we work with a lot of middle school teachers and students and parents, and it is a nightmare right now. And it's again a constellation of problems that have led to this. But we need some solution. We need some things to do while we're working on the underlying concern and problem that is more developmental. But yes, in future podcasts, we'll address those things and work towards that.
You know, I really do think we have a public policy issue here. I mean, our schools, and it's not the teacher's fault, and it's not the principal's fault, and it's not, our schools now have these children who are under socialized, who have these oppositional behaviors, who feel that they can get away with things. And you and I have talked about this, that if we don't have consequences, that what should a consequence do? It should show a child that they're better off cooperating. Okay. I worked with a wonderful psychologist when I was in Austin, Texas, and they had one child who was very well behaved. And he, every once in a while, would say, "No, I can't make you do it, but I can make you sorry that you didn't."
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And those are our only two choices. I would like for you to cooperate, but if you're not going to cooperate, then I can make you sorry that you didn't.
Right.
And that doesn't have to be physical, and that doesn't have to be mean-spirited,
Mhm.
but it has to be effective.
Right.
You have to come up with effective consequences for each child.
Right.
These kids just take more. There's
Right.
an intensity in these children that we don't have with others, but we have to be able to parent the difficult child, not just the easy ones.
Right, right, yeah, and when it comes to some of that, we're not even, and again, we have to go for today, but kids don't even have the consequences right now for not doing their academic work. We're giving grade recovery and all this kind of stuff, so students can go the entire quarter without doing any work and do a couple of Saturday work sessions, complete a packet, and get a C.
Right.
So there are no. Right now, we're having a difficulty applying consequences for anything as even as basic as academics.
Doing your homework,
Seems
right?
like it would be very cut and dry with academics, but
Right.
we're having a hard time even with that. So we do have a lot of work to do as kids get older, but we'll start to address some of those issues in the near future. So, all right, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.